This video contains detailed descriptions of real-life violence, murder, and forensic investigation. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Some content may be disturbing to sensitive audiences. Please proceed with caution. On January 5, 1999, a resident of Sant Salvador de Guardiola, a small village in the autonomous community of Catalonia, Spain, was excavating his garden to plant some olive trees. Approximately 1 meter into the ground, he dug out some human bones. He initially didn't think much of it and wrote them off as animal remains. He then started digging up another patch of ground before retiring for the night. The next day was a holiday, so he didn't do any work. The next 2 days gave him a lot of time to reconsider his theory, so when he began excavating again on January 8, he hoped to dig up the entire skeleton in case it belonged to a person. He dug up the entire skeleton and soon halted work completely, and called the police. It was now undeniable that the skeleton belonged to a human. The owner had placed some of the bones that had already been dug out in a plastic container, but left the bulk of the skeleton where he had found it. Because it had grown dark out and the weather was taking a turn for the worse, the police simply cordoned off the area, covered the skeleton with a tarp and decided to come back the next day. The police, together with forensic specialists, returned to the property on January 9. Before even learning much about the skeleton, they could learn about how the crime had likely gone down. First of all, the properties were not fenced off and were found far enough away from the house that anyone could have trespassed onto the property and buried the skeleton. The pit was also dug very crudely. Whoever was responsible likely used a hoe or a pick to dig the pit. Part of how they reached that conclusion was how uneven the makeshift grave was. Part of it was much deeper on one side than on the other. The deepest part of the grave reached about 80 centimeters deep, and the shallower part, was about 20 to 30 centimeters. In the deepest part, the skeleton was also wrapped in a white blanket and lying face down. She was completely unclothed. Inside the pit, someone had also buried a transparent plastic bag with a blue inscription that says Roca, another transparent plastic bag also with the blue inscription Mutexa, and 2 more transparent plastic bags with the black inscription Pseudo and a tawny background, a roll of red adhesive tape and an empty box of the kind used to store screws or dowels. Based on the nature of the hole, he likely underestimated how difficult digging a grave would be, got tired and gave up halfway through, just making do with what he already had. The nature and position of the body also indicated that, rather than a proper but off-the-record burial, the skeleton had likely been haphazardly tossed into the grave. Now it was time to turn their attention to the skeleton itself. Determining its gender was fairly easy, although how that was so made the case even more tragic. Upon examining the skeleton's pelvic cavity, the forensic specialists found the bones of a human fetus. It was hard to deny that the skeleton belonged to a woman. The skeleton was laid out on the autopsy table. They determined that she was likely 5 to 6 months pregnant based on the dimensions of the fetal bones. She was estimated to be 25 to 45 years old, was 1.71 meters tall and had likely died and was buried 15 to 20 years prior, pacing her death between 1984 to 1979. Based on her skull and facial features, she was of European ancestry, likely Western European or Scandinavian. This conclusion was further supported when investigators examined the blanket she had been wrapped in. The blanket had a German label, German writing, and had been manufactured in Germany, specifically East Germany, a country that no longer existed come 1999. At the end of the spine, she had an abnormal articulation of the last lumbar vertebra with the first sacral. Her big toe on her right foot didn't point toward the right as most would, but instead jutted toward her other foot, and lastly, her knees were also pointing toward each other. These were more distinctive features that could potentially be used to identify her. She had a somewhat sinuous fracture that went from the right side of the chin towards the teeth, towards the midline of the teeth. Based on the fracture, this was likely from a blow of some kind. The second injury was a bullet hole in her skull with both an entry and exit wound. With that, they had their cause of death. She had been shot once on the side of her head. Now it was time for the arduous task of identifying her. First, they went through their own reports and records, as well as questioning the residents. There were absolutely zero missing pregnant women in the area who matched the description. Next, they distributed information about her to various police stations throughout Spain. Next, they extracted DNA samples from the remains and compared them to all the samples in Spain's database at the time. There were no matches, so they then shared the samples with Europol and Interpol, but also to no avail. So finally, they issued an Interpol Black Notice under the belief that the victim may not be from Spain. With that, they wondered if they could perhaps identify the killer. They interviewed all the locals to ask about the land's previous owners in case they remembered them. Neighbors said that a German couple lived there with their 3 children around 16 to 17 years prior. Unfortunately, they didn't know where they had gone afterward. So the police tried digging through records and tracking them down themselves. The property's old owner was a man from the former nation of East Germany. The police didn't have enough to do anything with him, though. They still didn't know who the victim was, let alone have any proof linking him or the 3 other former owners to the murder. There wasn't even enough to question him on. So now, the police were at a deadlock. They had no more leads to pursue, so all they could do was just re-enter the victim's DNA and information into their databases every few months and check in with Interpol and Europol every 6 months in case there were any new additions to the databases that they could match to the woman. Every time, they were met with the same answer. In 2000, approaching the first anniversary of the discovery, the police had a facial reconstruction made of the victim's face. The reconstruction was then distributed to various police stations in Spain and published in the local newspapers. Sadly, it failed to jog anyone's memories. By now, she had obtained the nickname of La Mujer Sin Nombre, the nameless woman. For the next 4 years, they did their usual routine of re-entering the victim's information and checking back in with the international agencies every 6 months, only to once more be informed that they had no potential matches. On October 21, 2004, a judge at the Magistrates Court No. 4 of Manresa ordered the case to be officially shelved and for the body to finally be removed from the morgue and buried, citing the lack of any meaningful progress after 5 straight years of investigating. She was laid to rest at an unmarked grave in the Manresa cemetery. This officially put an end to the investigation. The fetus had been separated and buried in a box so that its bones wouldn't mix with its mother. The police did so in hopes that technological advances in DNA testing later down the road could identify its father. On January 4, 2011, a 57-year-old woman entered the police station on Príncipe de Asturias Street in Madrid to report her 24-year-old sister, María del Carmen Fraile Muñoz, missing. Carmen was born on September 3, 1956, in Madrid, and sadly, the 2 sisters had a bit of a rough upbringing. They lived with their 20-year-old father and 16 to 17-year-old mother in Vallecas. Their father divorced their mother, abandoned them and moved to Switzerland when they were both 4 and 6. Meanwhile, their mother started dating another man who only agreed to be with her if she abandoned her 2 daughters, so he wouldn't have to help raise them. Their mother felt that was a fair trade and soon joined their father in abandoning her daughters. While Carmen was sent to live with her grandmother, her sister had to live at Preventory de Guadarrama, a children's sanatorium during the reign of Francisco Franco, which was infamous for its abuse and poor conditions. Eventually, her sister left when she became an adult, and after Franco's death. The last time she saw Carmen was in November 1981, when Carmen showed up at her place of work unkempt, crying and seemingly pregnant. She left her alone for one moment so she could go fetch her bag, but in that brief window of time, Carmen had left, and she would never see her again. The last time she ever had any contact with her came 2 weeks later when she was sent a postcard from Carmen written in Barcelona. On December 25, 1981, she went to the police station to report Carmen missing. The officer who attended to her was beyond dismissive. He told her that Carmen had, in all likelihood, left of her own free will and that the disappearance was completely voluntary. She walked out of the police station without any report being filed. In 1993, she contacted a TV network called Telecinco. Telecinco was airing a Spanish remake of Unsolved Mysteries. She managed to have the show air a brief segment on Carmen, including who to contact if the viewers had any information. Nothing came of this. Then, starting in 1998, with the internet becoming more widespread in Spain, she would Google her sister's name every day just in case there was some clue she could use. Unfortunately, there was little to be done and essentially nothing to go on. So officially, the report was never really filed as they had nothing to report. Every January 4th, on the anniversary, she would come back only to be disregarded. In one instance, she even accused the officers of laughing at her. On May 13, 2017, Carmen's father, now in his 80s, petitioned the court to declare Carmen officially deceased. He went to his local police station in Vallecas and asked if they could find Carmen or look into her whereabouts. According to their computer systems and electronic databases, there were no records of her past 1981, she hadn't used any cards, identification, or filed for anything. Next, he went to her old workplace and was told she quit her job on July 1, 1981, without giving any notice or explanation. Because of his already distant relationship with his daughter, he had no reason to suspect anything had happened, as the two hardly spoke to begin with. His main reason for wanting her declared deceased was because in his mind, if Carmen was officially deceased, she would get none of her grandmother's will and all the money would go to his third daughter, the stepsister of Carmen and her sister. That was his sole motivation. This was also the first time in 3 decades that he ever had any involvement in his daughter's lives. On November 8, her sister contacted SOS Desaparecidos, a non-profit organization in Spain that exists for the express purpose of spreading awareness of missing persons in Spain. Then, on November 9, 2017, her daughter went to a different police station in Madrid on her behalf to file the report. Then the woman was 62. She came to the police after seeing an online bulletin in which a court in Madrid initiated the process to officially declare Carmen deceased at her father's behest. The bulletin stated that Carmen had 10 days to prove she was alive. She hoped that an active investigation and all the publicity might compel the courts to hold off on declaring her dead. On top of the long gap, she didn't have any photos of Carmen from when she disappeared, and her relationship with the rest of her family wasn't good, so she didn't even know what their homes looked like or where they were, so she couldn't tell them where she might have gone, and even if she did have a photo, it would be 36 years out of date. That being said, for the first time in 30 years, she met a group of police officers who took her seriously and were inclined to do whatever they could to help. That being said, there wasn't much they could even do to help. With nothing to show the public to jog their memories, a 3-decade-long gap and 0 leads for where she might have gone, she was warned that Carmen likely wouldn't be found and that she shouldn't get her hopes up. That being said, they did put up posters with what little information they had and informed various other police departments in Spain. The only thing they could do aside from waiting was DNA testing. Carmen's sister willingly offered up her DNA while her father was compelled to do so. They then entered the DNA into Spain's database of unidentified bodies and simply waited. It took a month and a half before they finally got a hit. On December 28, 2017, the DNA matched that of the skeleton found in 1999. Nobody, not even her sister, knew she had been pregnant. After 18 years, the Sant Salvador de Guardiola Jane Doe finally had a name. But that also meant that Carmen was not only deceased, but she had been murdered. They then exhumed the grave so that Carmen could be given a proper burial in a grave bearing her name, and so they could pull DNA from the fetus. The police questioned Carmen's family, looking for any suspects that could help solve the nearly 40-year-old case. According to her, sometime between April or May of 1981, her boyfriend was wondering if she knew any single women he could introduce her friend to. Her boyfriend came to know this man after importing some dogs in from German and needing the animal guides translated in Spanish. She recommended her sister, and so the two met. The man, named Manuel, was a German man who made a living translating German text into Spanish and Spanish into German. The man in question was 72-year-old Manuel Macaro Thierbach, and in the ensuing 40 years, he had graduated from being just a translator to a full-blown author with many published novels and often made public appearances at various literary events. Between 2010 and 2015 he had published 8 novels. He also denied even knowing Carmen when the police questioned him. Manuel was born on May 22, 1945, in a concentration camp in Halle, East Germany right toward the very end of World War II. After the camp was liberated, his mother, his only parent, decided to abandon him, so he grew up in an orphanage. In that orphanage, he was still mistreated, so he escaped. At age 11, he stowawayed on a merchant ship, which later docked in Barcelona, meaning he would start his new life in Spain. His new life was hardly any different than his old one, as he lived homeless in Barcelona, barely making a living, and spent most of the 1960s engaging in petty theft, meaning he was known to the police and even served time in prison. When the 1970s rolled around, he decided it was time for a change. He tried to turn his life around and set up a translation agency in Madrid. His motive for changing his life was likely the result of his marriage in 1971 and the children they were expecting to parent. According to Manuel himself, he also worked for various government agencies, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and even President Adolfo Suarez. His new life didn't last long, and he went bankrupt shortly after and went to collect scrap metal off the street in order to survive. He would try reinventing himself many times throughout the 80s, having several different jobs such as selling fire extinguishers and fireproof material, a company that grew to employ around 50 workers before going bankrupt. He sold crafts and jewelry, owned a chicken shop and was a kitchen assistant. He finally settled in Castellón, where he decided to become an author. As for his family, he didn't have a good relationship with his children, and on occasion, they even sued Manuel. Back in 1999, the police, when questioning the locals and going through the property records, knew that a German man and his family owned, or rather, were renting the land at the time, and moved out approximately 8 months after Carmen's likely time of death. The German in question was named Manuel. He had somebody he was supposedly friends with buried at his family home, while he continued to live a normal life with his wife and 3 children between the ages of 5 and 10. The police believed the circumstantial evidence alone was probable enough and asked the court for an arrest warrant. The court signed off on the warrant, and on December 18, 2018, Manuel was placed under arrest nearly 38 years after the murder. After his arrest, Manuel stayed silent and didn't say anything to the police. But although he wouldn't speak, he did consent to have his DNA taken. They then compared Manuel's DNA to that of the fetus. Meanwhile, Manuel was put before a judge while they awaited the results. While in court, Manuel told the judge a different story and admitted to knowing Carmen. He said that in his youth, he constantly had extramarital affairs and therefore cheated on his wife. He said that his wife was aware of this and let it happen. One of these women was Carmen. They met in Madrid, had sex one time, and then would occasionally meet again from time to time. Carmen then accompanied him to Barcelona and stayed for a weekend. Manuel said he only saw her when he left the hotel, because they were in the same hotel, sleeping, and Manuel spent most of his time at conferences and only returned to the hotel to sleep. During the conference, he met someone who told him about the urbanization going on at a small village outside of Barcelona named Sant Salvador de Guardiola, and that they were selling already completed houses at a very cheap price. With this in mind, he decided to move his business from Madrid to Barcelona and look into moving into one of those houses. When they arrived at the house, the one where Carmen would be buried, Manuel told Carmen he would be moving his family. He let her stay, but told him he was going to Madrid to close his business and move his family into the home, and ordered her to be gone by the time he and his family returned. When he returned, the home was messy, and it looked like there had been a party. Several items from within the home were also missing, such as a small television and a radio that Manuel had purchased. That was the last time he had ever seen Carmen, and he hadn't reported her missing or filed a report with the police over the theft. When the judge asked why he didn't report her missing, he said, "Carmen wasn't my business." While he admitted his relationship with Carmen, he predictably continued to deny any involvement. He told the judge he had never once held a gun in his life, denied ever laying his hand on any woman, and he didn't even know she was pregnant. He also said he moved out after 8 months, not because he buried a body on the yard, but just due to the price of the home. As for the blanket that wrapped Carmen's body being German, he said it was just a coincidence, and he knew nothing about it. He then told the judge that throughout his many affairs, he actually had 7 additional children out of wedlock and never killed his mistresses then. Because of this, Carmen wasn't special in his eyes, and so he had no motive. He also told the court that he had nothing to hide because he had never made any attempt to go on the run. The DNA tests had yet to come in, but lack of any physical evidence aside, Manuel had no criminal record, ties to the community, and he was a very ill man who was said to take around 20 to 30 pills a day due to his chronic diabetes and multiple arteriosclerosis as a result of a stroke. Therefore, the judge decided he would be released on a €150,000 bail pending the results of the DNA. On April 11, 2019, Manuel wrote a sworn statement to the judge and court to defend himself further. Once more, he said the fact that he didn't flee was evidence of his innocence. But it seemed his main defense, outlined in the statement, was to blame Carmen. He said that Carmen was demanding and likely got pregnant because she needed sex every 15 days, and then went on to say, if any trace of aggressiveness were to be found in me, it has always been in self-defense and against the unfair abuse of third parties. For example, in prison I had to bust open the head of an inmate who, in the company of 2 others, tried to rape me. The fight cost me 3 months locked up in the basement of the Okana prison. He once more denied being the father of her child and said even if she were pregnant with me, that's no reason to take a girl's life. And I don't even know if it's mine because she was quite prone to sex. The same day I met her, I slept with her and we swapped partners. She was very prone to changing men. Could it be that she had called a friend and arranged for him to come over and tell him she was pregnant, or some stranger who happened to be passing by? Someone could have seen her alone and assaulted her. He also talked about his relationship with other women as evidence of his innocence. He said, there is not a single complaint against me in 75 years of my life. No woman can say that I have humiliated, offended, beaten, insulted, or threatened her. Never, never. Because for me, a woman has only given me joy, pleasure, and I have never needed violence to pass it well. As for the German tag on the sheet, he said it was likely from a client from his translation company. He also had his own theory as to the murder. As mentioned, in the 10 days it took for him to travel to Madrid and bring his family to Sant Salvador de Guardiola, he believed Carmen had held a party in the home. He then suggested that one of her party guests had killed her and buried Carmen on his land without his knowledge. He said that if he was guilty, it would be outlandish to believe he'd bury her and the evidence a few meters from the house he lived in for almost a year. And when he finally moved out, he only moved to another village a short distance away. He said that he was guilty, he would have loaded Carmen up into his vehicle and driven a greater distance. His exact words were, logically, I'd be an idiot if I buried a body just 5 meters from the entrance to my house. His views on women didn't particularly endear him to the public and likely harmed his defense. Before his arrest, he made posts on social media having a low and misogynistic view of women, which he often posted about. After his arrest in March 2019, he logged back into his account and made a long, multi-paragraph post talking about such topics as, God created women to be subservient. This was made only 3 months after he underwent a court hearing for murdering Carmen. On May 13, 2019, Manuel's defense lost all credibility when the DNA tests finally came back. They were a match and identified Manuel as the father of Carmen's unborn child. On October 30 of that same year, the judge ordered Manuel to be arrested once more and held in pre-trial detention. His response to the results were to reiterate how that wasn't proof he was the killer. On February 11, 2021, the Barcelona Court of Appeals held a hearing on the case and made a ruling that many had dreaded and knew was coming. It being expected didn't make it any less frustrating. The murder had taken place in late 1981, nearly 38 years before the court hearing. In Spain, the statute of limitations was 20 years. Even if they were to be generous and conclude that everyone was wrong and that she died in 1994, the absolute earliest possible time of death, the statute of limitations still would have passed. There was absolutely nothing that could have been done, and it was ruled that the case would not go to trial. It was also pointed out that even without the statute of limitations, there would still be a chance Manuel wouldn't even be convicted. There was practically zero evidence, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, or even direct proof implicating him aside from his relationship to Carmen and being the father of the child. And even if there were any hypothetical witnesses, their recollection of the events would be nearly 40 years old and likely to be torn apart on cross-examination, as well as the question being raised as to why they didn't come forward. Is he likely the killer? Yes, albeit unlikely. Is it possible someone broke into the house while Manuel was away to rob it, came across Carmen, killed her and then buried her in the yard of the home he had just burgled, all without Manuel's knowledge? Again, unlikely but technically possible. It was due to these factors that the attorney for Carmen's sister announced he wouldn't appeal the ruling. That being said, the police, Carmen's sister and the Spanish public were confident that Manuel was the killer. After all, if he was innocent, why would he initially lie about knowing Carmen? This is what they believed happened. In mid-October 1981, Manuel and Carmen traveled together from Madrid to Barcelona using Carmen's car. They then found themselves both living in the same house that Manuel was due to rent. At some point, he learned of Carmen's pregnancy and that he was the likely father. He then decided he needed to hide this from his family, especially if they were going to move into the property with him. Sometime in November 1981, he killed Carmen by shooting her in the head, from behind and from a slightly elevated angle, using an unidentified firearm and unsure of how Manuel had obtained it. The gunshot would have likely killed Manuel instantly and her unborn child soon after. Next, Manuel was believed to have buried Carmen's body in the garden of the house he had rented. A few weeks later, when the grass and vegetation of the garden had grown enough to hide the disturbed soil and grave, he finally moved his family into the home. They only lived there for 8 months before Manuel, with much arguing, convinced his family to move out into a new home. Throughout 2019, Manuel would make many posts on his social media, but in March 2021, he finally stopped, likely due to the comments on every one of his posts filled with hate and anger directed toward him. After his legal victory, Manuel has kept a low profile and hasn't published another novel since, his career now officially dead. Carmen was soon reburied in the same unmarked grave the police set aside for her. Only the grave was no longer unmarked, and it now bore a sign reading, "Rest in peace Dona Carmen Fraile Muñoz and her unborn daughter Montserrat." If this story moved you or made you think, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.